Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to do in this section is we're going to burn the Capitol, settle Texas, save New Orleans, and call a lot of people cowards and traitors. We're going to talk about the War of 1812, the era of good feelings and bad feelings, and Andrew Jackson forever. There's the outline right up above me, and let's get into it. Now, this is all about what kind of America you want. And as we move through this, think about this. What kind of America you want? Do you want Andrew Jackson's America or Henry Clay's America? And is this like Alexander Hamilton's America or Thomas Jefferson's America? Because that's ultimately the point you should be asking whenever you're addressing any kind of political question. And all of this is in service to that question right up above me. What kind of America do you want? Would you prefer Hamilton's America or Jefferson's? Compare these two contrasting versions of the United States. Describe their role in the rise and fall of the first and second party systems. Are these perspectives valid today, and how so? And there's Election Day, 1815, right there. Because we're living in the world those people made, and your grandkids are going to live in the world you make today. We left off with the declaration of war on Great Britain, and we're going to talk about the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 is kind of this weird kind of war of accidents. Great Britain did not actually want to go to war with the United States. They were already at war with the French Empire on the continent. They were just not really interested in fighting this, opening up another huge series of battles in the United States. But the events of Europe were just completely consuming their time and energy. And the people that were assigned to the North to take care of Northern America were not like the A team in Great Britain. Probably weren't even the B or C teams. It was like people way down on the competence ladder. So Great Britain had to take into account the fact that they might go to war with the United States. So they made preparations to do so. And their plans for going to war with the United States were basically to set up outposts to supply these Indian nations. So if war erupts with the United States, they can quickly arm these Indian nations, and then the British Army itself can attack from the sea. And this is going to very rapidly knock the Americans back out of the war. But the problem is that the British preparations in case of war look exactly like preparations to make war. And to James Madison, this looks just like war. It looks just like the British are getting ready to attack the United States. He can't tell the difference. He's getting confused signals from Great Britain. It looks like the British are going to start a war. James Madison has had it. The British are impressing American sailors. They're impressing American soldiers. They're halting trade with France. Madison has had enough of it. He's going to do just like in that cartoon right over there. James Madison is going to give King George an old bloody nose. James Madison decides to declare war. However, James Madison has big problems. James Madison has three big problems that he doesn't really foresee in the middle of all of this. The first problem is that there is no real United States Army. James Madison decides to go to war without an army. The way that it was supposed to work in the United States was each state was supposed to call up its state militia, organize regiments of volunteers, and together they were going to form an army, just like they formed the Continental Army back during the Revolution. They thought this would be sufficient. It will not be. The second problem is that without the Bank of the United States and without nothing that even looks like a big Bank of the United States, James Madison has no real way to borrow large sums of money in order to build this American army, in order to build this American Navy. The financial institutions are simply not present. James Madison has no way, there's nobody that can loan the American government enough money to actively fight a war. And the third problem that James Madison has is that, well, it's the British Army itself. The Americans think that the British they're going to face in 1812 is the same British they faced back in the 1770s. This kind of very poorly led, poorly equipped, kind of half engaged British army of the American Revolution. And the British Army in 1812 is not that army. The British Army is not that. By 1812, the British Army has been fighting Napoleon Bonaparte for 9 years, all across Europe. The British Army of 1812 is a terrifying military machine. It is, salty sergeants, seasoned privates, officers that know exactly how to lead men into battle, officers that can read a terrain and take maximum advantage of it, naval captains who know exactly how to line up ships, exactly what to do with artillery, exactly how to devastate shore batteries. The British Army in 1812 is nothing like the old British Army that George Washington fought. The British Army in 1812 is absolutely, completely terrifying. The British Army is the army that defeated Napoleon Bonaparte twice. But James Madison doesn't recognize these problems. He thinks it's going to be another American Revolution and we're going to win and it's going to be a very, very simple task. And the British are all the way over in Europe. It can't be that easy. It can't be that hard. So James Madison declares war. It's the first time the United States has ever declared war. And they think it's going to be an easy victory. And it is absolutely not. The British bring the hammer down on the United States. The Americans don't even know what hit them. You can see from the map on the left, there are 4 major theaters of war in the 4 major theaters in the War of 1812. One, you have these small-scale battles in the Indiana Territory, and the governor of Indiana, a guy called William Henry Harrison, wins a rather minor victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Very minor. The second theater is up in Canada. James Monroe gives permission. They assemble an army from a few militia groups. These militia proceed to invade Canada. They capture the Canadian capital, which is a place called York. Today it's called Toronto. They burn it. Hooray! And then they encounter the Canadian militia backed by British regulars. And they take that American army and they tear it to shreds. The American army is smashed and it collapses in total defeat back to the United States. The British charge south, they seize Detroit, and the next few years are locked in this sort of deadly stalemate on the Great Lakes. They have these big naval battles on the Great Lakes. It's called the Carpenters' War, because basically to maintain the stalemate involves teams of carpenters building bigger and bigger ships as fast as they can. And the Great Lakes is very rapidly locked down, and the American humiliations in Canada are never avenged. The third theater of war is the ones where the British really excel. The British sail in the Royal Fleet in the Chesapeake Bay, right over there. There is no real American fleet to oppose them. They land troops just outside of Washington, just south of Baltimore, and the British Army moves towards Washington. James Madison calls forth the militias, says, okay, you guys have to defend Washington. And they go, we'll do it, President. We'll defend Washington with our last breath, or the 15 minutes it takes us to run away from the British. The Americans just scatter in front of the British. It's not even a serious battle. And James Madison is basically given only a few hours warning that the American army has scattered and the British are about to enter the city. They're about to capture Washington, D.C. And there is, right up above me, the image, a drawing of the British capture of Washington, D.C. with the president's mansion aflame. James Madison and James Monroe, his Secretary of State, very rapidly have to assemble and decamp the government. They move Congress. They get themselves out very quickly. They retreat to a small town just up the road called Brooksville. And they leave a few men in Washington to oversee the final evacuation of the city right before the British are about to take it. And the 2 guys they send to prepare the final evacuation of Washington are completely incompetent, and these guys leave. They run away. And it is a complete panic inside the city itself. They can hear the British approaching. British outriders are already circling the city. And one person steps up to oversee the evacuation of the White House and of the Capitol and of the city itself. Dolly Madison, the First Lady of the United States, is the one person who takes charge during this crisis. She oversees the evacuation of the White House. She assures everyone everything will be fine. She gets the people, she gets the women and children out of the city. She goes through the Capitol. She goes through the White House. She saves that very famous portrait of George Washington. She saves it. She saves the signed Declaration of Independence. She saves the official copy of the U.S. Constitution. She saves all of these precious artworks. And she gets all of this out of town literally not half an hour before the British take the city. And the British capture Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. And you can see right there the president's executive mansion burning as the British soldiers watch it. The Capitol building is only half finished. They burn that too. The Library of Congress burned to the ground. And the British discover something really kind of unfortunate about Washington, D.C., which is that Washington, D.C. is a brand new city, and it doesn't actually have a lot of people in it. And even though it's the capital of the United States, it's actually not that important a place. James Madison is able to reconstitute the government quite successfully. He's able to sort of start dragging a militia, forming a new army inland. The British don't want to get caught this deep inland, and Washington is not that important anyway. They withdraw, and they figure, Baltimore is actually much more important than Washington, D.C. And they sail up the river, and they begin to lay siege to Baltimore, Maryland. On the left, right there, that's the U.S. Capitol building after the British burn it. And James Madison reoccupies Washington, and he thinks it's very, very important to get everything up to speed as rapidly as possible to show Americans that even though the British burned Washington, the government's going to bounce back as quickly as possible. And he looks at the scorch marks and the burned parts of the presidential manor, and he says, look, we have to cover this up. We have to paint this as quickly as possible. And they go, well, the only thing we can get in large quantities, President, is white plaster. And James Madison is like, do it. Paint the building white. And that's the moment where the presidential mansion becomes the White House, painted white to cover up the scorch marks from when the British burned it. But up above me, the British move on Baltimore. The Americans try to put an army in front of Baltimore. The British just swat it aside. The army falls back to the outer defenses of Baltimore. The British just plow through them. The cowed Americans fall back to the inner defenses of Baltimore. And the inner defenses of Baltimore hang on this one huge fort called Fort McHenry. And this is basically the British plan. They're going to roll in and capture Baltimore. Baltimore is going to be their main base of operations. They're going to roll through Baltimore, and after they capture Baltimore, then they can roll up Philadelphia. After they roll up Philadelphia, they can roll up New York City. After they roll up New York City, the Americans are knocked out of the war. There's no way the Americans can bounce back from that. But to roll up Baltimore, they have to take Fort McHenry. And they have to do it without taking a lot of casualties. And it's one of the things the British generals are very savvy about. They're like, if we take this fort and we lose half our army, to get replacements, we've got to bring them all the way back from England. But the Americans are right here. So they decide that instead of a frontal attack on Fort McHenry, they're going to move all of their ships real close and just blast the unholy hell out of this fort. And that's what they decide to do. The Royal Navy moves in and just starts this ungodly barrage into Fort McHenry. And there's a painting of the bombardment of Fort McHenry itself. They're using these new experimental rockets that shoot through the air and impact the fort with huge explosions. And they just start blasting the fort all night long. And one of the people that watches this bombardment of Fort McHenry is an American captain on board the British ship. He was there to negotiate a prisoner release swap. And they did that, but the British captain was like, look, we are in the middle of a battle and you know where all of our ships are. So we can't let you go until this battle is finished, okay? And the American captain, whose name is Francis Scott Key, agrees to this. So he's trapped on this British ship just watching this unholy bombardment. And the British blast the hell out of Fort McHenry. It's on fire. Parts of it are exploding. It doesn't look like anybody is going to be able to survive what the British are doing to Fort McHenry. By dawn, by the dawn's early light, the sun comes up over the horizon, and Francis Scott Key, there's him up there on the left, watches the sun hit the remains of Fort McHenry, where the battered American survivors are still dug in, still refusing to move from the battered fort, and still flying the American flag. And Francis Scott Key is moved in a moment of joy to write a poem about this great endurance and strength of the men of Fort McHenry, because he can see by the dawn's early light and by the rocket's red glare, the bombs burst in the air that held proof through the night that our flag was still there. And this becomes known as the Star-Spangled Banner, which all of you have heard because I assume you've watched a football game or baseball game. And this is the origin of the American national anthem. The war, to say that the war is going badly is an understatement. The British do withdraw from Baltimore. They're not going to spend half their army taking Baltimore. But they can strike at any other moment. They occupy parts of the American coast, particularly parts of Maine and upper Massachusetts. They impose a blockade along the coast. The Americans know that there's this huge British army floating out there in the Atlantic. The invasion of Canada was a debacle. There's this weird stalemate on the Great Lakes. The war is going badly. And parts of the country don't even heed President Madison's call for a militia. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island contribute no men to the National Army. They will not loan the federal government any money. By the end of 1814, the Federalists of New England hold a series of secret meetings at Hartford, Connecticut. They decide, look, the war is over. James Madison has lost this war. What we need to do is force Madison to accept that the war is over. And they draft something called the Hartford Convention. And they're going to present this to James Madison. And they meet throughout the end of 1814 and into early 1815. And they demand four main things. One, an immediate end to the war. Two, the lifting of all embargoes. Three, a constitutional amendment limiting every president to only a single term. And four, the elimination of the 3/5 compromise. Not that they're abolitionists at all. They just don't want the southern states to have a lot of power because they blame the southern states for electing all these Democratic Republican presidents. And they don't actually come out and say it, but they strongly hint that if James Madison does not listen to the Hartford Convention, the states of New England will secede from the United States. They will form their own country. Or maybe they will rejoin the British Empire. And the Federalists commit to the Hartford Convention. But remember, I said there were 4 theaters of war in the War of 1812. Indiana Territory, Canada, Chesapeake, and the fourth one. The fourth one is in the South. And the story in the South is very, very different because it features a man named Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is an ex-barrister. He's a lawyer. He's a planter in Tennessee. He, met Aaron Burr when Aaron Burr was moving through the territory. And Andrew Jackson takes the Tennessee militia, and through sheer force of willpower, cussedness, and determination, he takes the Tennessee militia and turns it into this terrifying little fighting force. He turns it into a professional army and marches south. The Indian nations of the South largely side with the British, including the large Red Creek Nation, and they're being fed weapons and money through Pensacola, Florida. And Andrew Jackson takes the Tennessee militia and just tears into the Red Creeks. He fights a battle called the Battle of Talladega on November 9th, 1813, smashes the Red Creeks. He pushes south. The Red Creeks withdraw into this fortress that they've made at a place called Horseshoe Bend. Andrew Jackson turns it into a coffin. He tears down the fortress and storms into Horseshoe Bend on March 27th, 1814, utterly smashing the Creek Nation for all time. The remaining Creeks flee south, hoping that the British will protect them down in Pensacola. Not from Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson chases them all the way to Florida. Pensacola is being defended by both the British and the Spanish soldiers. Not enough of them, and they don't know who they're facing. Andrew Jackson defeats the British, the Creeks, and the Spanish, captures Pensacola, Florida. It is total and utter victory after victory after victory. And this is Andrew Jackson. But the real climax comes when that big British army floating off the coast decides that they have to intervene to help save their Indian allies in the South. They whip that army around and they land it south of New Orleans. And Andrew Jackson then whips his army into New Orleans, scrapes together any soldiers he can. He gets the free blacks of New Orleans on his side. He gets Cajun pirates to join him. The British just brush the U.S. Navy aside. So Andrew Jackson says, well, if your sailors aren't going to fight on your boat, you're going to fight in my army. He pulls all of these sailors off the ships, gives them muskets, and puts them in his army. And that's when Andrew Jackson meets a group of guys he really likes, because he's introduced to these fighting men of the Navy, these guys called the United States Marines. And he puts those guys front and center in his army. He lines it up, and at a place called Chalmette, he meets the British. And the British brought their A-team, the Scots Highlanders, elite British soldiers. And on January 8th, 1815, on the plains of Chalmette, the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson smashes the British. Smashes the British far more than Napoleon Bonaparte ever did. The British army is just obliterated. The general is killed. The British general Pakenham is shot. He's killed. And the British army just retreats back to their ships in total disarray. It is an absolutely tremendous victory. The invincible British, the victors of Europe, have been beaten by Andrew Jackson and the Tennessee militia. And word of Andrew Jackson's victories and Andrew Jackson himself, it comes all the way back to Washington, D.C., just in time for the publication of the Hartford Convention. The timing could not have been worse for the Federalists. The Federalists announced, the war is lost. We have to make terms with the British. And if we don't make terms, we're just going to quit the United States altogether. And then up rides Andrew Jackson, cheering the victories over the British, the final defeat of that terrifying British army, and news of all of these victories in the South. People look at the Federalists and they're like, you pack of cowards and traitors. You were going to stab your own president in the back when we were on the verge of greatness led by Andrew Jackson. All of the people, you could look on the Hartford Convention, Every politician that signed the Hartford Convention, their political career is over. In fact, their social lives have virtually ended. For years, anytime these people walk down the street, people spit where they've walked and whisper traitor and coward every time they walk by. The term Federalist itself becomes attached to this group of people that wanted to surrender to the hated British. The Federalist Party collapses. No one wants anything to do with the Federalists anymore. The first party system is at an end because of Andrew Jackson and the Hartford Convention. And finally, peace is declared. In fact, by a weird trick, the peace treaty was actually signed before the Battle of New Orleans. But politically, it doesn't matter. Washington heard about the Battle of New Orleans before they heard about the peace treaty. The Treaty of Ghent is signed the day before Christmas on 1814. And here's a painting, of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812. And the Democratic Republicans sent a pair of their new rising stars to help negotiate this treaty. And there's two of these guys, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, the second president, and this new brilliant congressman from Kentucky, a man named Henry Clay. And everyone is really impressed with Henry Clay. They're like, wow, this guy's going to go far. And John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay are the two rising stars of the Democratic Republic Party. And basically, the Treaty of Ghent just basically kind of admits nobody really wanted this war to begin with. Everything is kind of returned to its starting point. The British are going to keep Canada. They do declare that the Great Lakes will be forever demilitarized. The Americans are going to keep New Orleans. The British are like, well, we're sorry we burned your capital. The British promised not to search any more American ships, but it doesn't matter because the Napoleonic Wars are about to end with the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. So the War of 1812 just kind of ends with a shrug and a sigh. And the real fallout of the War of 1812 is the destruction of the Federalist Party. Everyone is just elated. There's peace. Andrew Jackson won the War of 1812. The embargo is lifted. The Federalist Party is gone forever. This is a period of American history called the Era of Good Feelings. It culminates with the election of the third president of the Virginia dynasty, President James Monroe, who makes as his Secretary of State the man who negotiated the Ghent Treaty, John Quincy Adams. It's just a good time to be alive. It's proud to be an American. There's only one party in the United States. It's a good time. It's a good time. And it's during the Era of Good Feelings that Henry Clay really begins to make his mark. Henry Clay becomes the Speaker of the House, and he promises a radical new plan for the United States, and he calls it the American System. The American system consists of a brand new federal program that's going to fund all of this internal improvement. It's going to fund bridges, roads, canals, railroads. This is all going to help, according to Henry Clay, this is all going to help American industry and American business. And from this improved American business is going to come more taxes. And from those taxes, we're going to use these taxes to build more bridges and roads and canals and railroads. And America, this is Henry Clay's proposition, with the American system, he promises, America will transform itself from an agrarian, backwards country into an economic powerhouse, just like Great Britain. This should sound very, very, very familiar. It really should. In fact, Henry Clay's American system should remind you of a plan proposed by, you know. He proposes the American system, but the American system is not implemented. It's greeted very coolly by James Monroe. Because again, James Monroe is still a Democratic Republican. And the idea of embracing this kind of industrial vision, this kind of commercial vision of America doesn't exactly sit well with him. And he's very slow to act on it. And Henry Clay gets very frustrated trying to act with James Monroe. And Henry Clay becomes convinced that the only way he could really implement the American system is by becoming President Henry Clay. Once Henry Clay is president, then he can transform America into what he thinks it should be, which is why Henry Clay prepares for the election of 1824. But the era of good feelings only lasts about 4 or 5 years. And the last act in the era of good feelings, or the first act in the era of bad feelings, depending on how you want to arrange it, is the formation of the Second Bank of the United States. James Monroe decided that one of the reasons that America got its ass kicked so badly in the War of 1812 is the president wasn't able to raise a lot of money. And he works with Henry Clay, and he works with these old Federalists to create an improved version of the old Hamiltonian Bank. And this is the very strong, very powerful Second Bank of the United States. And it's chartered in 1818. And its main goal is to stabilize the currency, to issue banknotes, and to rein in wild speculation. And when it's given this task, the first task it has to do, the Second Bank of the United States fails in a spectacular fashion. And the era of good feelings ends with the Panic of 1819, which is an economic collapse that ripples through the American economy. And this begins a period known as the era of bad feelings. And, well, I mean, this is life. The era of good feelings only lasts 4 years. The era of bad feelings will last about 10. In the Panic of 1819, people lose their shirt, businesses go under, people lose their farms, banks have to foreclose on debt. When the banks can't foreclose on the debt, the banks themselves collapse, people lose their life savings. It's bad. The Panic of 1819 is the worst economic depression America ever had up until that point. Things get so bad during the Panic of 1819 that people just start leaving. They know their farm has been seized. Their life savings that they left in a bank is gone because the bank is out of business. There's only one thing left to do for a lot of these people. When they're pushed to the edge of economic insolvency, when they owe all of this money, sometimes they just have to throw everything in a wagon or throw everything in a sack and go somewhere where their debtors can't reach them, to go someplace way out there where no one would think to look for them, to go to a place called Texas. Texas begins to open up. And one of the things that happens is Texas becomes a big beneficiary of the Panic of 1819. People that owe tremendous amounts of money and can't possibly repay it will just write GTT on the front of their house, gather up their possessions, and leave. And GTT, of course, standing for Gone to Texas. And that's where the creditors know not to look for them. And there's a lot of people who find themselves financially insolvent and just decide to start over in Texas. Texas is part of Mexico at the time. Well, sort of part of Mexico. It's part of the Spanish Empire, which is kind of part of Mexico. And their debtors can't reach them. And, some of the people we usually hail as Texas heroes start by being chased by debtors out of the United States, including Jim Bowie. During the era of bad feelings, there's another big downturn, which is that they go to admit Missouri as a state. But Missouri insists it's going to be admitted as a slave state. The northern states agree. They say, oh, okay, we will allow in Missouri as a state, but only as a free state. We will only accept Missouri as a new state if it gets rid of its slaves. And the southern states erupt in indignation. They absolutely go absolutely nuts. And this is the first major debate over slavery in the United States. The debate over Missouri's entry into the United States erupts for months until two different compromises are worked out by our boy, Henry Clay. He works out the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And the Missouri Compromise basically says two things. One, Missouri will be admitted as a slave state, but to balance out Missouri, they're going to create a new state in the north called Maine. Maine will be admitted as a free state. Therefore, the two states will balance each other out. This is the first serious crack in the United States over the slavery issue. And the Compromise of 1820 leaves a really foul taste in everybody's mouth. The Southerners are very upset that anyone is even questioning the legitimacy of slavery, because throughout this entire period, the South is getting more and more invested in the Cotton Kingdom and more invested in slavery and racism, and they become less tolerant of any challenges to their authority on this issue. But the North increasingly sees slavery as unpleasant at best, and at worst, a sin against the Almighty. It's another bad incident in the era of bad feelings. The era of bad feelings culminates in the election of 1824, in what is known as the election of the corrupt bargain. And it is the end of the Democratic-Republican Party. Over the issues over the Missouri Compromise, the issues over who is going to be president, the Democratic-Republican Party, the party founded by Thomas Jefferson, shatters. It shatters into four sections because there are four candidates for president. There is Henry Clay, who is convinced only by him becoming president can he implement the American system. He gets Kentucky because Henry Clay is from Kentucky. He gets Ohio because they're a big fan of roads in Ohio. And Missouri because he got Missouri in as a state during the Missouri Compromise. There is the Democratic Republicans. There's James Monroe's handpicked successor, John Quincy Adams. And Adams gets a lot of votes, particularly from the Northeast, the old Federalist stronghold. There's Crawford, which is the pick of the Southern planters. He only gets Virginia and Georgia because he's seen as more ideologically true to Thomas Jefferson. But the person who upsets everything is the war hero, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson views everything that James Monroe did, everything that John Quincy Adams is doing, everything that Henry Clay is proposing. He sees that as a gross violation of all of the ideals of Thomas Jefferson. And he decides that only he has the will and the strength and the gravitas to properly follow the dictates of Thomas Jefferson. And all four candidates split the vote. Nobody comes out with a clear majority. No one becomes president. And this is where the corrupt bargain takes place. Jackson received the most votes. He received the most electoral votes, and he received the largest share of the popular vote. So in Jackson's mind, he won the election, but he didn't win a majority. And the Constitution says when there's not a majority, it gets thrown in to Congress. But the problem is Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's in charge of making the decision. And what Henry Clay should have done, the ethical thing for Henry Clay to have done, would be to say, I'm the Speaker of the House and I'm also a candidate for president. The ethical thing would have been to recuse himself, to say, I really can't take place in this debate. But that's not what Henry Clay does. Henry Clay conceives a scheme, and this scheme will be known as the corrupt bargain. He goes to John Quincy Adams. Crawford is out of it. Crawford has like a massive stroke, and the guy's like can't even talk. He can't even make a sentence. The poor guy. but he is not going to be president. And he goes to John Quincy Adams and he says, look, John Quincy Adams, I will back you. I will throw the election to you in Congress. I'll set it up so that you'll win the congressional debate. I can make you president, but you have to make me Secretary of State. And John Quincy Adams agrees. And I mean, there was more skullduggery to it than that, but that's basically the corrupt bargain. The House of Representatives elects John Quincy Adams as President of the United States. And everybody says, this is a corrupt bargain. This is all behind the scheming. You know, Henry Clay just threw the election to John Quincy Adams because Henry Clay wants to be Secretary of State. Because remember, Secretary of State usually becomes the next president. Henry Clay denies it, he denies it, he denies it. And then John Quincy Adams makes Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Jackson is beyond furious. He's absolutely beyond furious. But he doesn't show it. In private, he's furious. Externally, he's in public, he's as calm as a cucumber. He just goes back to Tennessee and begins making plans. And the final act in the era of bad feelings occurs in 1826. And it is the final passing of the last of the founding fathers. In 1826, both Thomas Jefferson, third president, and John Adams, second president, are both on their deathbeds. These men, who were the best of friends during the Revolution, became the bitterest of enemies in the election of 1800. And now they're old, they're not in good health. After trying for years, they do rekindle their friendship. They do become friends again as very old men. But it's never quite the same. A friendship's once broken as badly as this friendship was, don't never heal completely. But they do become regular correspondents. And they're both very sick, and they know that the end is near in 1826. And they make their final preparations, and they die. Here's the creepy part, here's the incredible part. They both die on the same day. And that day, the 4th of July. And the last of the founding fathers are gone.